When the German Blitzkrieg rolled across Europe in 1939, it looked unstoppable. In Poland, France, and the Low Countries, entire armies collapsed under the thunder of armor. Panzer divisions moved like a storm, fast, ruthless, invincible. Soldiers on the ground could do little but watch as the steel beasts tore through their defenses. Rifle fire pinged harmlessly off the armor. Grenades bounced like pebbles. Machine guns were useless. For the first time in history, the infantrymen had become nearly helpless in the face of the tank. The world had entered a new age of warfare, and no one, not even the United States, had an answer. In 1940, as America watched Europe burn, the U.S. Army was still small, underfunded, and unequipped for a modern mechanized war. Its anti-tank weapons were relics, small-caliber guns, satchel charges, and improvised mines. Soldiers trained to fight like it was still 1918. In the field manuals, the tank was treated as something to be avoided, not fought. No rifle, no cannon that an infantryman could carry could stop it. But in laboratories and workshops across America, a few restless engineers refused to accept that. One of them was Major Leslie A. Skinner, an eccentric ordnance officer stationed at the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. He wasn't a soldier in the traditional sense. He was a scientist with a fascination for explosives and an almost childlike curiosity about weapons that might one day change the world. He had an idea that sounded like science fiction, a small, unguided rocket that could carry a shape charge, an explosive designed not to blast, but to pierce armor. The shape charge was a new invention, based on a principle discovered accidentally in Switzerland in the 1930s. When an explosive was molded into a hollow cone with a metal liner, it focused its energy into a single jet of molten metal that could slice through steel like butter. It was the first time chemistry could outmatch armor. The only question was how to deliver it. Skinner and his team experimented in secret, building crude prototypes out of pipes, wooden handles, and leftover munitions. One design, a 2.36-inch rocket with a shape-charge warhead, worked perfectly in theory, but had no launcher. The rocket could penetrate armor thicker than any tank then in service, but no soldier could throw it far enough to survive the blast. The weapon needed a delivery system, something light, portable, and simple. That answer came from another man, Captain Edward G. Uhl, a young engineer who joined Skinner's team in 1942. Uhl was practical, resourceful, and bold. When he first saw Skinner's prototype, he realized what it could become. The problem, he said later, was not the rocket, it was how to fire it. He said, "We had the bullet, but no gun." Legend has it that Uhl found the solution in the simplest way possible. He walked through the workshop, saw a pile of scrap metal tubing, and picked one up. It was long, hollow, and light enough to shoulder. He loaded the rocket inside, attached a primitive trigger and battery ignition, and stepped out to the firing range. The first shot was clumsy. The rocket wobbled, then soared, and when it struck the target plate, it punched a glowing hole clean through it. Uhl turned to Skinner and said, "Sir, it looks like we've got ourselves a bazooka." The name came from a comedian. Bazooka was the nickname of a homemade musical instrument played by radio star Bob Burns, a long comical brass tube that made a deep honking sound. The resemblance to the new launcher was uncanny. The nickname stuck instantly. At first, few in the Army took the weapon seriously. To generals used to thinking in tons and calibers, a pipe that fired a rocket seemed absurd. "You can't fight tanks with plumbing," one colonel scoffed. But when the Ordnance Department brought the prototype to a live fire demonstration, the laughter stopped. In front of an audience of officers, the two men loaded the weapon, took aim at a captured tank plate, and fired. The warhead detonated with a sharp crack. When the smoke cleared, the steel target had a hole the size of a fist burned straight through it. The officers stared in silence. That moment, at Aberdeen Proving Ground, 1942, marked the birth of modern infantry anti-tank warfare. Within weeks, the weapon was approved for limited production as the rocket launcher M1 2.36-inch. The Army ordered a few hundred for field testing. The design was crude, a simple tube, battery ignition, no safety, and a flimsy shoulder rest, but it worked. Soldiers now could carry a weapon that gave them a fighting chance against armor. Skinner and Uhl's invention wasn't just a new weapon, it was a psychological revolution. For the first time, a single man could face a tank without suicidal courage. For the first time, the balance between man and machine had shifted. In the months before the weapon's deployment, the U.S. Army ran frantic tests. Soldiers practiced loading rockets in trenches, aiming with crude iron sights, and firing from the shoulder. Early models were temperamental. Batteries failed in cold weather, wires snapped, and rockets occasionally misfired. Yet even in its flaws, the weapon's potential was undeniable. In October 1942, a small shipment of bazookas were sent overseas, quietly, without fanfare. They would soon arrive in North Africa, where America's inexperienced army was preparing to face the veterans of the German Afrika Korps. No one could have known it then, but those simple metal tubes would change the nature of ground combat forever. Somewhere in the Tunisian desert, a group of American infantrymen were about to learn whether their new weapon could truly stop a Panzer, or whether it was just another desperate experiment doomed to fail. The answer would come at a place called Kasserine Pass.
The first time a German Panzer crew saw a bazooka, they didn't know what it was. It was February 1943. The barren hills of Tunisia were burning under the winter sun, and the Battle of Kasserine Pass had begun. Across the narrow mountain roads and rocky wadis, General Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps had launched a counterattack that slammed into the green, untested troops of the U.S. Second Corps. The Germans expected another easy victory, and for the first few hours, that's exactly what they got. American lines broke under the weight of the assault. Panzers punched through at speed, their 50mm guns hammering American positions while half-tracks spewed machine gun fire. Infantry scattered. Artillery crews abandoned their guns. From inside their steel hulls, German tank commanders could see panic spreading like wildfire. The Americans, one Panzer officer wrote later, fought bravely but without coordination. They were still learning what war meant. But scattered among those retreating riflemen were small groups of soldiers carrying something new. Long metal tubes slung over their shoulders, the size of a broom handle but heavier, stranger. The weapon had no reputation, no legend. It hadn't even been properly field tested. Most of the men using it had never fired one in anger. To them it looked like a gamble, a piece of plumbing that promised miracles. Among them was Private Henry W. Hank Langford, a 22-year-old infantryman from Ohio. He and his loader, Corporal Sam Dyer, had been assigned one of the new rocket launchers only days before the battle. Their sergeant told them, "If it moves on tracks, you point that thing at it and pray." They didn't even have extra batteries for the firing circuit. That morning, as dust clouds rose from the valley, Langford spotted the unmistakable silhouette of a Panzer III grinding up the ridge toward them. The tank's gray paint was mottled with desert dust, its treads clattering like thunder. His rifle might as well have been a toothpick. The bazooka was his only chance. He and Dyer crouched behind a rock outcrop. Langford loaded one of the new M6 rockets, a green cylinder tipped with a shaped charge, the result of all those lab experiments back in Aberdeen. His hands shook as he raised the launcher to his shoulder. "You sure this thing works?" Dyer whispered. "Guess we're about to find out," Langford said. When the tank closed to within 80 yards, he fired. The rocket screamed away, leaving a trail of white smoke across the valley. For an instant, it looked like it might miss. Then it struck the side of the Panzer with a sharp flash and a blast that sounded more like a thunderclap than an explosion. A thin jet of molten copper tore through the armor, igniting the fuel lines inside. The tank stopped dead. Flames burst from its hatches. Langford stared in disbelief. "Jesus," he muttered, "it worked." For the Germans, the shock was even greater. Surviving crew members who bailed out later reported their confusion. The Americans have rockets, fired by hand. It seemed impossible. Tanks had always been the hunters. Now they were prey. That single hit marked the bazooka's arrival on the world stage. As more American units joined the battle, other infantrymen began using the weapon with improvised tactics. They hid behind wrecked vehicles, waited for tanks to pass, and then fired into their flanks. At close range, the shaped charge didn't just damage, it annihilated. The 2.36-inch warhead could burn through 75 millimeters of armor, enough to penetrate even the thick frontal plating of a Panzer III or IV. For the first time, a single soldier could destroy what had once been the most feared weapon on Earth. German commanders at Kasserine were stunned. Reports from the front spoke of portable anti-tank rockets, infantrymen carrying tubes, and vehicles destroyed by unknown weapons. Rommel, ever the realist, didn't dismiss it. He immediately ordered intelligence officers to investigate and recover an intact specimen. The German High Command soon received fragments of one launcher, scorched, dented, but unmistakably revolutionary. But the weapon was far from perfect. Many early bazookas malfunctioned. Some failed to ignite because of weak electrical circuits. Others fizzled out mid-flight. A few rockets even exploded in the tube, wounding their gunners. Soldiers joked darkly, "You either kill a tank or yourself." Still, the effect on morale was undeniable. For American infantry, the psychological balance had shifted. They no longer felt helpless. As the battle dragged on, German tankers began to grow cautious. Infantry with rockets, one Panzer commander noted in his logbook, "They wait until we are close, very close, then fire from nowhere. The effect is devastating." From that point onward, many Panzer units began to advance with greater hesitation, sending infantry scouts ahead to flush out potential ambushes. The mere existence of the bazooka changed the rhythm of combat. At Kasserine, the Americans still lost, strategically. The Afrika Korps overran several U.S. positions and forced a withdrawal. But tactically, something had shifted forever. A few dozen crude launchers rushed into battle with no manuals and minimal training had proven that the tank was no longer invincible. In the aftermath, American officers collected field reports. They noted every success, every failure. The weapon's wiring needed improvement. The battery system had to be replaced. But the concept, the heart of it, was sound. The bazooka had drawn blood. And back in Washington, those reports reached the desk of General George C. Marshall. He read the summaries, the diagrams, the first-hand accounts of tanks destroyed by a weapon fired from a man's shoulder, and he smiled. "Gentlemen," he said to his staff, "it seems we've just changed the game." By the end of 1943, production ramped up. Thousands of improved M1A1 bazookas were shipped overseas. The weapon's flaws would be fixed, its circuits strengthened, its rockets refined. What had been a desperate experiment was becoming a standard tool of war. But the Germans had also learned a lesson. They would not ignore what they had seen in Tunisia. In workshops back in Europe, German engineers began sketching copies of the American rocket launcher, a weapon that would soon return to the battlefield under a new name, the Panzer. The race had begun, not for bigger tanks, but for better ways to destroy them. By the summer of 1943, the shockwaves from Kasserine had spread far beyond the desert. In Berlin, the German High Command studied every scrap of intelligence about the strange American weapon that had burned through their panzers. The reports were clear and unsettling. Allied infantry now carried a portable launcher capable of piercing tank armor at close range. For a military machine built on the supremacy of steel, this was heresy. The German Armaments Office summoned engineers from firms like Rheinmetall Borsig and Hassag to study the fragments of captured weapons. The Americans called it a bazooka. Its design was crude, an open tube, battery ignition, light enough for a man to carry. But simplicity, the Germans realized, was its genius. Within weeks, they began developing their own version, a larger, heavier launcher firing an 88mm rocket with an even more powerful, shaped charge warhead. It would be called the Raketen Panzer Buchset 43, soon nicknamed by the soldiers the Panzerschreck, the tank's terror. When the first prototypes appeared on German training grounds in late 1943, the results were immediate. The weapon could knock out any Allied tank then in service. But in a twist of irony, it borrowed nearly every concept from the very enemy it sought to defeat. The weapon that had terrified German crews at Kasserine now returned in German hands. Meanwhile, the Americans were refining their own design. The early M1 launchers were replaced by the M1A1 and later the M9, with sturdier wiring, a better trigger, and replaceable battery packs. The rockets improved too. The M6A3's redesigned warhead could punch through up to 100 millimeters of armor, enough to take down even the Panzer IV and the dreaded Tiger if hit from the side or rear. In Italy, the weapon came into its own. As American and British forces slogged up the Apennines in 1943, bazooka teams became the spearhead of every assault. The narrow mountain roads and ancient villages gave tanks little room to maneuver. Infantry squads with bazookas hid in stone houses, alleys, and vineyards, waiting for panzers to appear. When they did, the air filled with the hiss of rockets and the thunder of detonations. Private First Class Joseph Pinder of the 135th Infantry remembered it vividly. You could hear them before you saw them, the tanks, the squeal of the treads. We'd sit quiet, fingers on the trigger, praying the rocket would fire. When it hit, it wasn't a big explosion, just a flash and a hole. But it was enough. The beast stopped moving. For the Germans, the terror once reserved for their enemies began to come home. Panzer crews who had once mocked American equipment now eyed every patch of rubble and brush with suspicion. The bazooka's range was short, about 100 yards, but in the close quarter battles of Italy and later France, that was all a soldier needed. By 1944, the bazooka had spread across every American unit in the European theater. Paratroopers carried them folded into halves during D-Day. Rangers used them to destroy bunkers in Normandy. Marines lugged them through the jungles of the Pacific, where the weapon proved equally deadly against Japanese tanks and pillboxes. It was no longer a prototype. It was an icon. But with its success came imitation. The German Panzer, larger and deadlier, began appearing in frontline units during the battles of Kursk and Normandy. Unlike the bazooka, it had no battery. Instead, it used a percussion firing system and a blast shield to protect the gunner from backblast flames. The weapon could destroy a Sherman tank from nearly 200 yards. American crews learned to fear its long tube and glowing rocket trail. Still, even this deadly successor carried the mark of its origin, the simple American idea that a single man could wield enough firepower to challenge a machine. The age of invincible tank was ending on both sides. In Normandy, that truth played out brutally. As Allied forces fought through the Bocage, the thick, hedgerow-filled countryside of northern France, tank crews on both sides lived in constant dread. For every panzer hidden in the brush, there was a man with a rocket launcher waiting in the shadows. The air reeked of smoke and burning rubber. Lieutenant Karl-Heinz Stigler of the 12th SS Panzer Division recalled his first encounter with the bazooka during the battle for Caen. "We saw movement in the hedgerows. I ordered the gunner to fire. Before we could traverse the turret, there was a streak of smoke, then fire everywhere. It was not artillery. It came from the infantry. My driver was dead. We didn't even see who fired." The Germans called it the Donnerschreck, the Thunder Terror. They feared it not because it was perfect, but because it was everywhere. Every American squad seemed to have one. Every road, every field, every farmhouse could hide a man who could kill a tank. Back in the United States, production soared. Between 1942 and 1944, American factories built over 300,000 bazookas and nearly 15 million rockets. They were shipped to Europe, the Pacific, and even to Soviet forces under Lend-Lease. The weapon had evolved from an experiment into an industrial product, rugged, cheap, and unstoppable in quantity. And while the Germans improved their own version, they could never match the scale. For every Panzerschreck built, America produced 10 bazookas. For every German tank, there were 100 American infantrymen carrying tubes that could kill it. By late 1944, the Germans had stopped laughing. In reports to Berlin, Panzer commanders described the fear of entering urban combat. One wrote bitterly, "Our tanks cannot advance without infantry clearing every street. The Americans are ghosts with rockets." That phrase, "ghosts with rockets," became a whispered acknowledgement among armored crews. The psychological edge that Panzers once commanded had evaporated. Steel no longer ruled fear, the infantryman did. The bazooka was not flawless. Its range was limited, its backblast revealed the shooter, and it struggled against the heaviest tanks at long distance. But its importance was never just mechanical. It was moral. It gave soldiers something they had lacked since 1939, a sense that the tank was no longer a god of war. In field letters home, GIs often wrote about the weapon with a strange affection. "It's like carrying thunder," one said. Another wrote simply, "You feel 10 feet tall with one of these." The Germans, for all their engineering, could not unlearn what they had felt at Kasserine, the sight of infantry standing their ground while a panzer burned. The age of armor's invincibility was gone, and in its place, a new balance of terror had been born. By the summer of 1944, the bazooka was everywhere. From the beaches of Normandy to the shattered ruins of French towns, American infantry carried the long green launchers slung over their shoulders like instruments of thunder. It was no longer an experimental weapon or a secret tool. It was standard issue. And in the chaos of Europe's liberation, it became the infantryman's great equalizer. On the morning of June 6, 1944, as the first waves of American troops stormed Omaha and Utah beaches, the bazooka went ashore with them. Engineers and assault teams carried the weapon in waterproof bags, wading through surf and gunfire. The steel doors of German bunkers loomed ahead, concrete monsters spitting machine gun fire. In the desperate fight for the beachheads, soldiers used the bazooka not just against tanks, but against pillboxes and gun nests. Firing at close range, the shaped-charged warhead could blast open embrasures or rip through rebar and concrete. It was crude, improvised, but effective. Private James Conley of the 1st Infantry Division remembered his first shot. "We couldn't get close with grenades, so I took the bazooka, aimed at a slit in the bunker, and fired. The rocket went straight in, then boom! After that, the firing stopped. That thing wasn't a rifle. It was a key that opened hell." The weapon that had begun life as a lab experiment in Maryland was now reshaping the battlefield of Europe. As Allied forces pushed inland, the terrain changed, and with it, the bazooka's purpose evolved. In the hedgerows of Normandy, tanks could barely move without exposing themselves to ambush. German Panzers, once the predators of open plains, now found themselves creeping along narrow lanes walled in by earthen mounds and thick brush. Every hedge concealed danger. American squads learned to work in pairs, one soldier with a rifle or BAR, the other with a bazooka. They would wait in silence until a tank's turret passed, then step out, aim for the thinner side or rear armor, and fire at close range. It was a deadly, intimate form of warfare, men and machines fighting within yards of each other. In Company E of the 9th Infantry Regiment, a bazooka team destroyed 3 German tanks in a single day near Saint-Lô. The after-action report noted, "They fired from such close range that the heat singed their faces." That kind of bravery, and the weapon that made it possible, became legend among infantrymen. For German tank crews, the battlefield had become a nightmare. The thunder of their own engines now masked the sound of incoming rockets. The first warning was often a streak of smoke, or the clang of molten metal tearing through armor. "It was as if the air itself attacked," wrote one Panzer commander, after surviving a bazooka ambush near Falaise. "We no longer feared artillery. We feared the men we could not see." By August 1944, the psychological effect of the bazooka was greater than its physical destruction. It forced panzers to stay back, to rely on infantry screens, to advance cautiously where they had once charged fearlessly. What had been a momentum weapon had become one of hesitation. Rommel himself, before his death, warned Berlin that Allied infantry weapons, light, portable, and numerous, were making his tanks blind and slow. The weapon's legend only grew in the months that followed.
In the cold forests of the Ardennes, during the Battle of the Bulge, the bazooka proved once again that it could decide moments far larger than itself. In December 1944, the German army launched its final massive counterattack, sending hundreds of tanks through the snow-covered hills of Belgium. American lines buckled, but didn't break. Small, isolated units held out, armed with little more than rifles, grenades, and bazookas. At Bastogne, paratroopers of the 101st Airborne used them relentlessly. When German tanks tried to overrun their positions, the paratroopers fired from basements, foxholes, even from behind stacks of frozen hay. One team knocked out at Tiger 1 by firing into its tracks, then finishing it off from the rear. The Tiger's thick armor could shrug off shells from long range, but not a shaped-charge warhead from 20 yards. A sergeant of the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment later said, "When the tanks came, we didn't run anymore. We grabbed the bazooka. That thing gave us guts." The bazooka also adapted to new roles. Infantrymen used it to blow open walls, detonate ammunition dumps, even clear sniper nests. In Italy, partisans smuggled them into mountain passes to ambush convoys. In France, resistance fighters called them the American Dragon. Everywhere it went, it changed the psychology of war. No tank, no bunker, no fortress felt untouchable anymore. The Germans, recognizing their own vulnerability, doubled down on their copy, the Panzer and expanded its use. But even that came too late. The tide of war was irreversible. For every German rocket launcher built, America sent a dozen bazookas to the front, each one simpler, lighter, and faster to produce. By early 1945, Allied infantry were storming across the Rhine, the final road to Berlin. The once dreaded Panzers, symbols of the Blitzkrieg, were now shadows of their former glory. Underpowered, short on fuel, and hunted by men carrying the same kind of weapon that had humbled them in Tunisia. In a bitter twist of irony, the very German crews who had once mocked the crude American launcher now feared it above all else. A German tank gunner captured near Remagen told his interrogators, "We never believed a single man could destroy a Panzer. Now we see it every day. The tank is no longer the god of battle." The end came quickly. By the spring of 1945, bazooka teams were clearing streets in Cologne, crossing the Rhine, and fighting through towns that had been built centuries before gunpowder. In the ruins of Germany, the weapon that had begun as a desperate invention of necessity became a symbol of inevitability. When the war finally ended, American ordnance officers estimated that over 475,000 bazookas had been produced and used across all theaters, from Tunisia to Okinawa. It had destroyed tanks, bunkers, and walls, but more than that, it had destroyed the myth of invincibility. The bazooka had redefined the battlefield. It wasn't just another weapon, it was the great equalizer, the proof that ingenuity and courage could level even the mightiest machine. In the aftermath, one American officer summarized it simply in his report to the War Department. The bazooka did for the infantrymen what the tank once did for the army. It gave him back his power. What had begun as a desperate answer to an unanswerable question in 1942 had by 1945 reshaped the entire doctrine of warfare. The age of armored invincibility was over. The age of the individual soldier had returned. When the guns fell silent in 1945, and the world began to count the cost of its most terrible war, there was a quiet moment in the back rooms of armories and workshops, a reckoning among engineers, soldiers, and historians. They all asked the same question: how had something so small, so simple, reshaped the face of modern war? The answer lay in a 5-foot metal tube and a rocket no bigger than a man's forearm. The bazooka, born out of desperation, had changed everything. Its creators, Major Leslie Skinner and Captain Edward Ull, returned home to quiet honors. There were no parades for engineers, no medals for men who worked in laboratories. But within the corridors of the U.S. Ordnance Department, their invention was spoken of with reverence. They had done what seemed impossible. They had given the infantrymen a weapon powerful enough to challenge steel, and in doing so, they had restored balance to the battlefield.
When All was later asked what he thought of his creation, he said simply, "We built it because the soldier had nothing else." Then, after a pause, it gave him hope. In the months after the war, captured German documents revealed just how deeply the bazooka had shaken the Wehrmacht. Reports from Panzer divisions described it as a weapon of terror used by invisible men. German engineers admitted that their own copy, the Panzer was directly inspired by it. The irony was painful. The weapon that began as America's desperate defense had become the template for Germany's final desperate countermeasure. But the legacy didn't stop there. The Soviet Union, always watching and adapting, examined captured launchers and began developing its own version. By 1949, the RPG-2 was in production, soon to evolve into the RPG-7, a weapon that would echo the bazooka's design for the next 70 years. From Korea to Vietnam, Afghanistan to Ukraine, that same concept, a man, a tube, a rocket, became the eternal equation of modern war. The bazooka had become the grandfather of all shoulder-fired anti-tank weapons. In the years following the war, the U.S. military refined the weapon into new generations. The M20 Super Bazooka entered service during the Korean War, longer and more powerful, firing a 3.5-inch rocket that could destroy even the heaviest Soviet-built T-34s. American soldiers and Marines carried them up frozen hills and through rice paddies, firing at enemy armor in battles that often mirrored those of Tunisia and Normandy. Different continents, same story. Lieutenant Charles Jenkins, who fought in Korea, once said, "When you see a tank coming down the street, it's like watching a god approach. But when you've got a bazooka, you don't pray anymore. You fight." That sentiment, the empowerment of the lone soldier, was the bazooka's true gift to history. During the Vietnam War, the concept evolved again. The Law, light anti-tank weapon, and later the AT-4 carried the same spirit in smaller, more efficient forms. But every time a soldier shouldered one of those weapons, the lineage was unmistakable. It all went back to those two men in a Maryland workshop and the first rocket that tore through steel. Even in the 21st century, the DNA of the bazooka remains alive in weapons like the Javelin, the Carl Gustav, and the NLAW. Guided, smarter, and far more lethal, but spiritually the same. The same promise echoes through time, that technology can give one man the power to face a machine. But beyond the mechanics, there was something more enduring, the psychological revolution it caused. Before the bazooka, tanks ruled by fear. Infantrymen scattered at their sight. After the bazooka, that fear shifted. Tanks began to move cautiously, their crews haunted by the idea that somewhere in the rubble or the trees, an unseen soldier was waiting with a rocket that could end them. War had been democratized. Power had been leveled. That balance remains one of the defining truths of modern conflict. No machine, no matter how mighty, is untouchable. In 1947, when General George C. Marshall visited Aberdeen Proving Ground, he asked to see one of the original launchers. It was old now, the paint chipped, the wiring frayed, the same model that had been rushed into battle at Kasserine Pass. He held it for a long moment, then turned to the officers beside him. "This," he said softly, "was the end of the tank's monopoly." He wasn't exaggerating. The bazooka had altered not only the tactics of war, but its philosophy. It proved that ingenuity could defeat intimidation, that courage could be multiplied by invention, and that the balance of terror between man and machine could always be recalibrated. Across the Atlantic, in post-war Germany, captured bazookas were displayed in military museums as both trophies and warnings. Former Panzer officers spoke of the first time they saw one fired. One recalled, "We thought it was a trick. We thought no man could carry a weapon that kills armor. And then we saw the smoke and fire, and we knew." That moment, that realization, marked the end of an era. The myth of the invincible Panzer, of the unstoppable tank, had died not in a great armored duel, but in the hands of ordinary soldiers carrying tubes of steel and faith. Even today, in the quiet halls of the U.S. Army Ordnance Museum, One of those original M1 bazookas still sits behind glass. Its green paint has faded, its battery compartment corroded with age. The sign beside it reads simply, Rocket Launcher, M1 Bazooka. First used in combat, Kasserine Pass, February 1943. Designed by Major Leslie Skinner and Captain Edward All. The weapon that gave the infantrymen power over armor. Visitors stand before it and imagine the sound. That first hiss of ignition, that streak of smoke, that impossible moment when one lone soldier stopped a tank. They see not a relic of destruction, but a monument to human ingenuity. Because in the end, the bazooka was never just about firepower. It was about balance, the eternal struggle between defense and offense, between might and mind. It was a reminder that every empire, every machine, every illusion of invincibility can be undone by the right idea at the right time. At Kasserine Pass in 1943, when German tank crews first saw that streak of smoke arcing from a soldier's shoulder, they witnessed not just a weapon, but the future. A man, one man, had just rewritten the rules of war.